Some secrets stay buried only until the right person comes to unearth them. When Thomas Mitchell encountered a stranger at his father's grave, he never imagined how her revelations would rewrite his family's history and open his heart to possibilities he'd long since abandoned. Stay with me until the end to discover how one chance meeting connected two broken families and healed wounds that had festered for decades, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to see more stories about the unexpected ways our lives can transform when we're brave enough to face the truth. The cemetery was silent except for the distant call of birds and the soft rustle of autumn leaves skittering across the pathways. Thomas Mitchell stood before his father's grave, hands thrust deep in the pockets of his worn leather jacket, his breath forming small clouds in the October chill. "Hey, Dad," he said quietly, the words familiar after 5 years of these one-sided conversations. "Sorry it's been a while. Work's been crazy, and Emma had the flu last week." The granite headstone offered no response. Robert James Mitchell, 1945 to 2018, beloved husband and father. Simple, understated, just as his father had been in life. Thomas shifted his weight, wincing slightly at the twinge in his knee, an old college football injury that acted up in cold weather. At 38, he sometimes felt decades older, worn down by the responsibilities of single parenthood and the weight of grief that never quite lifted. "Emma's doing well in school," he continued, picturing his 10-year-old daughter with her gap-toothed smile and curious eyes. "She got the lead in the school play. You would have been proud. She's fearless on stage, just like Mom was." The mention of his late wife sent the familiar ache through his chest. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, taken by the same aggressive cancer that had claimed his mother decades earlier. Some days, the symmetry of his losses seemed like a cruel joke, both his mother and wife gone too soon, leaving him and his father as single parents, now him alone to raise Emma. "I wish you were here, Dad," Thomas said softly. "I could use your advice. Emma's starting to ask more questions about Sarah, about Mom too. I never know what to say." The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Thomas glanced up, annoyed at the intrusion on his private moment. A woman was walking purposefully through the cemetery, her dark hair lifting slightly in the breeze. She wore a gray coat cinched at the waist, carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. Thomas turned back to his father's grave, expecting the woman to pass by. Instead, the footsteps slowed and then stopped nearby. He could feel her presence just a few feet away, an uncomfortable awareness prickling at the back of his neck. When he finally looked up again, the woman was standing at the grave directly beside his father's, a simple marker he'd never paid much attention to before. She placed the lilies carefully at the base of the stone, then stood with her head bowed. Thomas tried to focus on his own thoughts, to recapture the thread of his one-sided conversation with his father, but the woman's presence was distracting. There was something about her, a familiar quality he couldn't place. He found himself studying her profile, mid-30s perhaps, with high cheekbones and a straight nose, her expression solemn as she gazed at the headstone. As if sensing his scrutiny, she turned suddenly, meeting his eyes. Hers were a striking blue-gray, like the ocean during a storm. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low and slightly husky. "I didn't mean to interrupt your visit." "You didn't," Thomas replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The woman's gaze shifted to his father's headstone, reading the inscription. A small furrow appeared between her brows. "Robert Mitchell," she said, almost to herself. Then, looking back at Thomas, "You're his son?" The question caught Thomas off guard. "Yes. Did you know my father?" The woman hesitated, something unreadable flickering across her face. "No," she said finally. "Not exactly. But I've heard his name." Before Thomas could ask what she meant, she gestured to the grave where she'd placed the lilies. "Eleanor Winters," she said. "Did you know her?" Thomas glanced at the headstone he'd passed countless times without really seeing. Eleanor Grace Winters, 1950 to 1995, forever in our hearts. "No," he admitted. I don't recognize the name. The woman nodded, as if his answer confirmed something for her. She was my mother, she said simply. She died when I was 12. I'm sorry, Thomas said, the words inadequate but sincere. My mother died when I was young too. Cancer. Car accident, the woman replied. A beat of silence passed between them, the shared understanding of early loss creating an unexpected connection. I'm Thomas Mitchell, he said, extending his hand. She hesitated briefly before taking it. Her hand was cool but her grip firm. Claire Winters. As their hands touched, Thomas felt a strange jolt of recognition, though he was certain they'd never met. There was something in her eyes, the shape of her face. I should go, Claire said abruptly, withdrawing her hand. I've taken up enough of your time. You haven't, Thomas found himself saying. It's nice to have actual conversation here for a change. Usually, I just talk to myself. A small smile touched her lips. I know what you mean. Though sometimes I think they hear us anyway. I hope so, Thomas said, glancing back at his father's grave. There's a lot I never got to tell him. Claire followed his gaze, that same furrow appearing between her brows. Were you close? You and your father? Very, Thomas nodded. Especially after my mom died. It was just the two of us for a long time. Then I met my wife, Sarah, and things were good for a while. But she passed away 3 years ago, so now it's just me and my daughter, Emma. I'm sorry about your wife, Claire said, genuine sympathy in her voice. It must be difficult, raising a child alone. It has its challenges, Thomas admitted. But Emma's amazing. She makes it all worthwhile. He paused, then asked, do you have children? No, Claire said, something wistful crossing her features. Never found the right time. Or the right person, I suppose. Another silence fell between them, comfortable despite the circumstances of their meeting. Thomas found himself reluctant to end the conversation, though he couldn't have explained why. Your mother, he said, nodding toward Eleanor's grave. You were young when she died. Did your father raise you alone too? Claire's expression changed, a guardedness coming over her features. No, she said after a moment. My father wasn't in the picture. My aunt raised me. I'm sorry, Thomas said again, feeling like he'd stumbled into sensitive territory. I didn't mean to pry. It's fine, Claire assured him, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a long time ago. She glanced at her watch, then back at him with what seemed like reluctance. I really should go. I have a meeting in half an hour. Of course, Thomas said, stepping back slightly. It was nice meeting you, Claire. You too, Thomas. She hesitated, then added, I come here the first Sunday of every month. Perhaps I'll see you again sometime. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her gray coat fluttering slightly in the autumn breeze. Thomas watched her go, struck by the strange feeling that something significant had just happened, though he couldn't have said what. His gaze drifted to Eleanor Winter's grave, so close to his father's that the stones nearly touched. Had his father known this woman? Had they been friends, perhaps, cemetery neighbors whose families now visited on the same days? With one last look at his father's headstone, Thomas turned to leave, his thoughts still lingering on the mysterious Claire Winters and her storm-colored eyes. Dad! You're burning the pancakes. Emma's voice jolted Thomas back to the present. He looked down to find the edges of the pancake smoking slightly in the pan. Sorry, Peanut, he said, quickly flipping it to reveal a charred underside. Looks like this one's for me. Emma wrinkled her nose, her freckles bunching together in a way that reminded Thomas painfully of Sarah. You always say that when you burn them. That's because I'm a noble, self-sacrificing father, Thomas replied, sliding the overcooked pancake onto his own plate. It's in the job description. Emma giggled, the sound lightening something in Thomas's chest. At 10, she was at that precious in-between stage, still his little girl in many ways, but with flashes of the young woman she would become. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her pajamas featuring characters from a show she'd recently claimed to be too old for, but still watched when she thought he wasn't paying attention. "Did you visit Grandpa yesterday?" she asked, drowning her perfect pancake in maple syrup. Thomas nodded, pouring more batter into the pan. "I did. I told him about your play." "Did you tell him I'm nervous?" Emma asked, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "No," Thomas said honestly. "Because Grandpa always said Mitchell women are born for the stage, just like your mom. He wouldn't believe you were nervous for a second." Emma smiled at that, pleased by the connection to the grandmother she'd never known and the mother she was beginning to forget. It broke Thomas's heart sometimes, the way Sarah was fading from Emma's memory, just impressions now, feelings rather than clear recollections. "I met someone at the cemetery," Thomas said, surprising himself. He hadn't planned to mention Claire. Emma's eyes widened with interest. "Like, met someone? Or just met someone?" Thomas laughed at her emphasis. "Just met someone. A woman visiting her mother's grave next to Grandpa's." "Was she pretty?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. Thomas hesitated, the image of Claire's storm-gray eyes and solemn expression rising in his mind. "Yes," he admitted. "She was. Are you going to see her again?" Emma pressed, a hopeful note in her voice that Thomas recognized all too well. Despite his best efforts to shield her from his own loneliness, Emma had developed a not-so-subtle interest in his non-existent love life. "It wasn't like that, Peanut," Thomas said gently. "We just talked for a few minutes. She visits her mom's grave on the first Sunday of each month, that's all." "Well, today is the first Sunday of November," Emma pointed out with exaggerated casualness. "You could go back." Thomas flipped another pancake, buying time. The truth was, he had thought about returning to the cemetery today, though he told himself it was just to maintain his regular schedule of visits to his father. The possibility of seeing Claire again was merely incidental. "I don't know," he said finally. "I have a lot of work to catch up on, and you have homework." "I finished my homework yesterday," Emma interrupted triumphantly. "And Lily's mom said I could come over to practice our lines for the play. They're picking me up at 11. Thomas raised an eyebrow at his daughter. "You've got this all figured out, don't you?" Emma shrugged, the picture of innocence. "I'm just saying, if you wanted to go to the cemetery again, you could. No reason not to." "I'll think about it," Thomas promised, knowing he was already decided. Something about Claire Winters had intrigued him, not just her beauty, though that was undeniable, but the strange connection he'd felt, the way she'd looked at his father's grave with that puzzled expression. After dropping Emma at her friend's house, enduring knowing looks from Lily's mother, who had been trying to set him up with her single friends for the past year, Thomas found himself driving toward the cemetery almost on autopilot. He told himself he was just maintaining routine, that seeing Claire again would be a coincidence rather than a purpose. The cemetery was busier than the day before, with several cars parked along the winding drive. Sunday visitors paying respects to loved ones, leaving fresh flowers before another week began. Thomas followed the familiar path to his father's grave, his eyes scanning the area for a gray coat and dark hair. His heart sank slightly when he reached the grave and found it empty, no sign of Claire at Eleanor Winter's headstone either. He'd missed her, or perhaps she hadn't come today after all. "I'm not stalking her, Dad," he said quietly to the granite marker. "Just thought it might be nice to talk to an actual adult for a change. Emma's great, but her conversation topics are limited to her play and why I should let her get a pet hedgehog." "Hedgehogs make terrible pets," a voice said from behind him. "Too nocturnal. She'd be disappointed." Thomas turned to find Claire standing a few feet away, a fresh bouquet of lilies in her arms. She wore a blue sweater today under a tan trench coat, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I'll add that to my list of objections," Thomas said, unable to keep the smile from his face. "Along with the exotic pet permit required in our state and the specialized diet." "You've done your research," Claire observed, moving to place the flowers at her mother's grave. "Emma's very persistent," Thomas replied. "She's been campaigning for a hedgehog for months. I think she saw a cute video online." Claire smiled, and Thomas was struck again by the strange familiarity of her features. Had they met somewhere before? A conference, perhaps, or a local event? "I wasn't sure you'd come today," she said, straightening up from arranging the flowers. 2 days in a row is a lot, even for the devoted. "Emma had a play date," Thomas explained, not wanting to admit he'd come hoping to see her again. "Thought I'd stop by while I had some free time." Claire nodded, seeming to accept this explanation. "How old is your daughter?" 10, Thomas said. "Going on 30, if you ask her. She's at that age where she thinks she knows everything." "I remember that age," Claire said with a small smile. "Though in my case, I was probably insufferable. My aunt used to say I was born arguing." "Emma's the same way," Thomas laughed. "Gets it from her mother. Sarah was a lawyer, could argue the spots off a leopard." At the mention of Sarah, a shadow seemed to pass over Claire's face, so quickly Thomas thought he might have imagined it. "You said yesterday that your father wasn't in the picture," Thomas said, changing the subject. "If you don't mind me asking, did he pass away too?" Claire's expression grew guarded again. "No," she said after a moment. "At least, I don't think so. I never knew him. My mother, she never told anyone who he was. Not even her sister, my aunt who raised me." "That must have been difficult," Thomas said, genuinely sympathetic. His own losses had been devastating, but at least he'd had the chance to know and love his parents and wife before losing them. "It was," Claire acknowledged. "Growing up without a father, watching other kids with their dads, it leaves a hole. I used to make up stories about him, that he was a spy, or an astronaut, someone who had to stay away to protect us." She gave a self-deprecating smile. "Childish fantasies." "Not childish," Thomas disagreed. "Natural. We all want to understand where we come from." Claire studied him for a moment, as if making a decision. "That's actually why I'm here this weekend," she said finally. "Not just for my regular visit to Mom. I've been doing some research into my family history, trying to piece together who my father might have been." "Any leads?" Thomas asked, genuinely interested. "Maybe," Claire said, her gaze drifting to his father's headstone. "My mother kept journals. My aunt gave them to me when I turned 30, but I couldn't bring myself to read them until recently. There are hints. Names. Dates. Places that might be significant." Thomas followed her gaze to his father's grave, a strange feeling settling in his stomach. "And that's why you asked if I knew your mother yesterday. You're trying to find connections." "Yes," Claire admitted. "I've been visiting the graves of people mentioned in my mother's journals, looking for, I don't know, answers, I suppose. Or at least more pieces of the puzzle." "Was my father mentioned in your mother's journals?" Thomas asked, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. Claire met his eyes directly, those storm-gray irises unflinching. "Yes," she said simply. "Several times." The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath Thomas's feet. "They knew each other?" "It appears so," Claire said carefully. "Though I don't know the extent of their relationship. The entries are cryptic in places. Emotional." Thomas looked back at the two graves, side by side in the quiet cemetery. His father and Claire's mother, their final resting places nearly touching. What were the odds of